Welcome, friends. Thank you for joining us tonight. We have been having some difficulty connecting on some of our to some of our channels on social media. So thank you for your patience. We're gonna try right now for the folks joining us on YouTube. We're gonna do our best to be able to share directly to our YouTube. Sorry, the folks joining us on Facebook, we're going to be sharing directly to from our YouTube channel to Facebook, since we're having some difficulty today connecting directly to Facebook. So if you can just bear with us, those of you joining us on YouTube, we are trying right now to post tonight on Facebook, and I'm having difficulty. Wait, are you able to do it, Jen?
It's loading. Yeah, I think I'm good. Yeah.
Okay. Which Facebook page are we on right now? Are we on?
I'm going to do it, or not yet, but I'm going to do it on the New Creation Ministries.
Okay, so maybe there's something with the platform that I'm using to broadcast tonight, but we're just going to get started tonight. Jen works in the background to make it happen on all the platforms. Well, we're going to continue teaching on the letter of Paul to the Galatians, and this is one of my those passages, those books in the Bible that I go to often, because it's just full of relevant truth. Okay, let me just correct that. It's just full of truth. Truth does not need a qualifier. It's just full of truth that can benefit us as believers, wherever we are in our walk with God. So today we're going to continue from Galatians chapter 1, from verse 11. Last week we were discussing how Paul marveled that the Galatians were so soon removed from the simplicity of the gospel. And we discussed a lot of things relating to that last week, about how the gospel, anything that diminishes the work of Christ or the effect of Christ's work, is essentially another gospel. It's a false gospel, a gospel that diminishes Christ's complete work, a gospel that belittles the work of Christ, a gospel that talks of the work of Christ as if there is more needed to be done other than what Christ has done. That is not the true gospel. And we see that Paul went all out on this when he was rebuking the church. He was not really being patient with them, really, because he was defending the gospel. So let's turn to Galatians chapter 1. And today we're going to continue from verse 11. And what Paul is talking about here is authority and an apostleship. So it's authority and its office. So Galatians chapter 1 from verse 11. It said, "But I certify you, brothers, that the gospel which was preached of me is not after man, for I neither received it of man, neither was I taught it, but by the revelation of Jesus Christ." And this is an important point that Paul was making. It is known to the church at the time that Paul was not one of the original disciples of Jesus Christ, that he wasn't there with Jesus during those 3 years of ministry in Judea, that Paul was not in private counsel with Jesus like the other apostles were. So what Paul was talking to them about is that he is not like all the other people who came after and they learned this thing directly from the disciples. He said, no, I learned the things that I'm teaching directly from Jesus Christ. Now, this is not to say that there's anything wrong with learning from people, but Paul was making a case here. Defending is authority. Defending is apostleship because of the nature of the subject that he's dealing with. He is correcting the churches of Galatia, on an error. And we'll see it because the people who brought the error into the Galatian churches are people we call the Judaizers. And these are people who are calling the church back into Judaism. And Paul was defending it. These are people who mainly were from the Jerusalem area. So some of the way they go after Paul is the authority and his apostleship. Paul here was making a case that no, I did not receive my gospel from people. I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ himself. This is an important point because Paul was saying that no, this is what Jesus committed to the church. This is what Jesus gave to the church. So Paul went out and made that case. Now, what can we take from that? Does that mean that we should all claim that we receive our gospel as revelation? Well, to some degree, we all need to have a revelation of the gospel uh, in our heart so that it's not a head knowledge, but it is something that's alive in us. The Bible tells us, the Bible tells us that we are able ministers, not of the letter, but of the spirit. Therefore, the letter kills, but the spirit gives life. There's got to be a revelation of truth on the inside of you so that it's not just head knowledge or something that you memorize or something that you're striving to live for. There's got to be a revelation. But the revelation has to be based on the revealed truth of scriptures. So that's what Paul is making a case. He said, I certify to you that the gospel that he received was from Jesus Christ. Like I said earlier, the people propagating the other gospel, they have a connection to Jerusalem. That's where the church first started. That's where the early apostles are. So Paul had to address the origin of his gospel, and the beginning of the origin of his gospel is making a defense that what he's teaching is directly from Jesus Christ. Right? Later on, he continued to build on that. So let's move on quickly. He said, now to build on that, Paul said, you remember, look at verse 13, it said, for you have heard of my conversation or my behavior or my lifestyle in time past in the Jews' religion, how that beyond measure I persecuted the church of God and wasted it, and profited in the Jews' religion above many my equals in my own nation, being more exceedingly zealous of the traditions of my fathers. Now, so Paul then, in order to build this case, to build the case for his authority, it said, no, you got to remember. You remember my life. You remember what you've heard about my conversation. You knew who I was. You knew how I persecuted the church. I was zealous for the Jewish law. I was zealous for the Jewish religion. I served God within the Jewish religion, persecuting the church. I was so zealous. I was putting Christians in jail. I said, you remember, even above many is equal. It said he excelled because he was exceedingly zealous of the traditions of his fathers. This is saying that Paul is saying, listen, I lived under the law. I obeyed the law. I was overly and abundantly zealous for the things that the law said. He said, but you see, I had an encounter with Jesus Christ. Verse 15, it says, but when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me by his grace to reveal his son in me, that I might preach him among the Gentiles or the heathen, immediately I conferred not with flesh and blood. So here you see Paul making a case and saying, I was already under the law. I knew what it's all about. I was circumcised. I was zealous. I learned all the rules and I kept all as much of them as I can. I knew the law. It says, even compared to his equals, he excelled because he's zealous. He persecuted the church. He did all of that. He said, but then when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me by his grace to reveal his son in me, that I might preach him among the Gentiles, immediately I conferred not with flesh and blood. So here is talking about his authority. God is the one that called him. And I'm going to make a side comment here. It said, God separated him from his mother's womb. And this is one of the reasons why we believe in the sanctity of human life, that a baby that is in the womb is still a baby, is still a person that God has set apart for his own purpose. We see here that God separated Paul from his mother's womb and called him by his grace to reveal the Son in me that I might preach him among the Gentiles. Immediately I conferred not with flesh and blood. This is what is making a case that, listen, I didn't go to Jerusalem to get endorsement. Verse 17 said, neither went I up to Jerusalem to them which were apostles before me, but I went into Arabia and returned again unto Damascus. Then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter and abode with him 15 days. So it said, I conferred not with flesh and blood. What he's trying to establish here is that his apostleship was not something that he received from Peter, James, John, or any of the other apostles in Jerusalem. It said when he got saved, when he encountered Christ, he did not go and have a conference with them to say, oh, is this the gospel that I should preach? It said he instead went into Arabia. He went back to Tarsus. He went back to his hometown. And then after 3 years, he went up to Jerusalem to see Peter and abode with him for 15 days. So it's basically establishing here, I only spent 15 days with Peter. So the things that I preach couldn't have been from Peter. Then he goes on, he said, but of the other of the apostles saw I none except James, the Lord's brother. Now the things which I write unto you, behold, before God I lie not. Afterwards I came into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and was unknown by face unto the churches of Judea, which were in Christ. Now remember, the church started in Judea, specifically in Jerusalem. So it's basically making a case here. I spent 15 days with Peter. I saw James, the Lord's brother. But the other disciples, the other apostles, I didn't really see. And the churches in Judea did not even know him by face. Only, verse 23, but they had heard only that he which persecuted us in time past now preaches the faith which once he destroyed, and they glorified God in me. Why would Paul go to this extent to talk about the beginning when he wants to address the issue of the law coming to the church? He's trying to establish an origin narrative to make it so clear that the origin of his gospel, even though he's consistent with the same gospel that the apostles preached, did not come from the apostles, that Jesus himself revealed the gospel to Paul. Now, no one said, why would he need to do all of that? Because he's establishing his apostleship, that his office is just as strong and as valid as Peter, James, and John, or any of the other 12 apostles. And this is an important thing because it's bold and gutsy for Paul to do this, but it is necessary because of the development that was happening in the church, as we'll see as we study next week. Then look at chapter 2. Let's go into chapter 2. Chapter 2, verse 1. It said, then 14 years after, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas and took Titus with me also. And when I went up by revelation and communicated unto them that gospel, which I preach among the Gentiles, but privately to them which were of reputation, lest by enemies I should run or had run in vain. And then it goes on there. So now Paul is establishing something here, and I love it. So I have some notes here. It says first, it made a point here. It said, when he got saved, he went into Arabia. 3 years later, he came to Jerusalem, spent 15 days with Peter. Then he departed. And the next time he was back in Jerusalem was 14 years after. That's significant amount of time. And 14 years after, when he went back to Jerusalem, he had already been preaching the gospel. He had already been seeing miracles happening, people getting saved, people getting filled with the Holy Spirit, and things are already happening. He was already established as an apostle. He was already preaching the gospel. And he said, when I came, he went up with Barnabas, and they declared to the church there the gospel which they have preached among the Gentiles. Paul basically has made a case here. He said to demonstrate, I have some notes here, said to demonstrate the origin of his gospel. Paul went on to describe his relationship at the beginning with the apostles and the church in Jerusalem. We see it. It was virtually non-existent, only that he had spent 2 weeks with Peter. He did not go to Jerusalem for at least 3 years, so he couldn't have received or taught anything by the church in Jerusalem. And then later, 14 years. So we're looking at a period probably between 14 and 17 years, including years of ministry and teaching the gospel to Gentiles that have passed. And then he went back to Jerusalem, where the apostles themselves now recognize the grace of God on Paul. So we see that in what verse is that? Chapter 2, verse 7. It said, but contrariwise, when they saw that the gospel of the uncircumcision was committed unto me, as the gospel of the circumcision was unto Peter. Verse 9. And when Barnabas and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given unto me, they gave to me and Barnabas the right hands of fellowship, that we should go unto the heathen and they unto the circumcision. Here, Paul was establishing that, listen, it took 14 to 17 years after he had gotten saved, after in which he has been preaching the gospel, before he actually had a conference with the church in Jerusalem, at which point they endorsed the gospel which he preached. So he started out defending his authority. If you look at this particular letter, in the very opening sentence, Paul started with a defense of his authority and apostleship. This is necessary for the rest of the argument that Paul will make in the gospel, in the letter to the Galatians. The questioning of Paul's authority, which unfortunately still continues still in some limited circle until today. The questioning of his authority, the questioning of his apostleship, Paul was defending it because he is, after all, the apostle commissioned to reach the Gentiles. Now, this is an interesting thing for us to look at, because as Paul built his case here, it said in verse 3, it said, when he went to Jerusalem and had a council with the church leaders in Jerusalem, verse 3 said, but neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. Here, we now get into the meat of the issue. For the first time, it's talking about circumcision. First, it's been talking about another gospel. For somebody who is unfamiliar with what was happening in the church at that time, would not understand why all of a sudden it's talking about circumcision in relation to Titus. Titus was a Greek. One of his parents is Greek and the other is Jewish. Now, what the church was doing in Galatia was they're now getting circumcised in order to feel that they are accepted by Christ, which is another gospel. It's not the gospel. They're going back to Jewish law, to circumcision, to keeping of holidays, to keeping of feasts and festivals and so on. They're going back to the law. So Paul was saying, I've preached the gospel 14 years to 17 years later. I went to Jerusalem. I brought with me a Greek person, but the church in Jerusalem did not even compel the Greek person, Titus, to be circumcised. And that because of false brothers, unawares, I'm back to verse 4 now, chapter 2, verse 4. And that because of false brothers, unawares brought in, who came in privily to spy out our liberty, which we have in Christ Jesus, that they might bring us into bondage, to whom we gave place by subjection. No, not for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. Here, Paul was basically telling them, even when he went to Jerusalem, he had contention with those false brothers who were bringing the law into the church. Here, we're going to leave it here for today. What Paul basically was establishing is that he is called as an apostle to the Gentiles. by Jesus Christ, that his authority was not conferred on him by Peter, James, or John, or any of the other 12, that the authority was conferred on him by God, who called him, separated him from his mother's womb. And he also showed us here that even at that time, he had contention. He had contention with the Judaizers, with those false brothers who were already there in Jerusalem. He said, we give them place by subjection, no, not for an hour. Here we see the beginning of the argument that is going to be setting the stage for the rest of the study of the book of Galatians. We have some technical difficulties today, so I'm just going to hand it right here. But I hope that this has been a good study for you. Please join us next week, because we're going to be getting into the meat of the study of the book of Galatians. Thank you for joining us tonight. Share this with your friends and invite them to join us next time. If you're in the Greater Toronto area, we invite you to New Creation Church. Come visit us. Check us out on our website at newcreationchurch.ca. We'd love to see you. Have a good one. Bye.